The victims of the Atlanta Ripper or Rippers number over 24. Due to time constraints, we talk in this interview about just a few of them. To see the list of women who are horrifically murdered in the streets and alleyways of Atlanta, forever laid to rest by a brutal killer or killers, please go to my website, mostnotorious.com, at the link provided in the show notes. You can also, of course, buy the book written by my guest, Jeffery Wells, The Atlanta Ripper, for more detailed information of all the women whose lives were taken during this dark, dark era of Atlanta history. Hello all, and welcome to the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. Thanks so much for downloading and listening. I'm always eternally appreciative of your interest and support. I am so pleased to have Jeffery Wells as my guest today. He is an author, historian, a professor of history, and vice president of online education at Georgia Military College. He also has a blog called Georgia Mysteries. The book he is here to chat about today is called The Atlanta Ripper, the Unsolved Case of the Gate City's Most Infamous Murders. So great to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation. I am very grateful for the opportunity to talk to your audience.
Yes. So is this a well-known series of murders in Georgia? How did you first hear about them?
Well, it's becoming more well-known, and I certainly won't take all of the credit for that. I believe my book, published about 10, 12 years ago, helped to thrust it a little bit more into the spotlight. And recently, there are several major Atlanta news outlets who've done investigative reports on it. I was actually able to participate in one of those, and we did kind of an in-depth look at what this was and how it affected the greater environment of Atlanta at that time. There have been some other podcasts throughout the years that have focused on this, and they have all collectively, as you're doing yourself, done a great job of bringing this in more and more into the limelight, where it deserves to be, because there are certainly lessons that we can learn from this epic in Georgia, Atlanta, and in American history, because it does intersect all three. So with that being said, I learned about it back in 2006 as I was teaching. I just started my college teaching career after doing about a decade stint teaching high school. And I was teaching an American history course, the second half, where we talked about Reconstruction leading into the Jim Crow era, then moving into the progressive era in American history. So one of the things we were focusing on was the fact that the progressives did not do a whole lot to progress, if you will, race relations in the country, particularly in the American South. And one of my students had actually read an article, we were talking after class, had read an article that he found very interesting in light of the class discussion we just had about the 1906 Atlanta Race Riots, which, if you will, were somewhat of a precursor to these events. They all came so close together. And he said, have you ever read about Atlanta's Jack the Ripper? And of course, me being the enthusiast of not only history, but the history of American and world crime, or crime, I guess you would call it crime, the history of crime, I just jumped right on that. I mean, who would not be interested in talking more about something that they called Atlanta's Jack the Ripper? And so we read the article, I read over it, and it was in Creative Loafing magazine and was written by a guy named Steve Fennessy in 2005. I would say he did probably more so than anyone at that time to bring about a knowledge and an awareness of those crimes that had happened a little less than 100 years ago at that time. And so I wrote the book and got a contract from what is called the History Press to write the book. And I believe that what I did basically was, push it even further out into the sunshine than he had back in 2005. But to be honest with you, Eric, I sort of stumbled upon it myself. I wish I had a little bit more of a sexier story to tell you about how this kind of dropped in my lap, but it was just that simple.
Sure, yeah. So you mentioned the Jack the Ripper murders, which happened 20, 25 years or so before these murders were committed. The Atlanta Ripper moniker, it was based on Jack the Rippers, right? And created by Atlanta newspaper men.
Interestingly enough, it was. And I say that, well, ironically, actually, the Atlanta Press named this phenomenon, they called the murderer, or even the series of murders, if you will, the Atlanta Ripper murders. And it did. It did harken back to the days of the London murderer, Jack the Ripper, because some of these things, of course, did parallel. For example, these were women, younger women that were killed. And as you know, the London murder spree actually involved younger Londonites who were women. And these were all done in a somewhat similar manner, although not entirely. You did have a few who were bludgeoned to death. You had a couple of victims who were shot, and then those who were cut, their throats cut, and parts of their bodies who were cut. So some of the imagery that you do see is very similar to the imagery that you saw during the Jack the Ripper phenomenon. So yes. Now, as far as who specifically called it that, originally the perpetrator here was referred to as the Fiend, which is kind of spooky enough, if you will. But they began to refer to, as they continued to happen, and it appeared that there was a serial killer at work, or a serial killer and a few copycats, whatever the case may be, they began to call them Ripper-like murders, and then eventually Atlanta Ripper murders. So absolutely, that is very much accurate.
Interesting. I think 4 out of the canonical five Jack the Ripper victims were in their 40s. Only Mary Kelly was younger. Does that match pretty well with the ages of the Atlanta Ripper victims?
These women tended to be slightly younger than that, although some of them did border those ages. And ironically enough, we don't have a lot of serial killers throughout history that went after elderly people. You do have some episodes of that, but for the most part, serial killers in history have preyed upon either children or younger people. So yeah, Jack the Ripper, I think he cut it right in the middle. But the women in Atlanta who fell victim to the Fiend and then became known as the Atlanta Ripper, they were slightly younger, although some were not very much younger. And there were also a lot more.
I definitely want to ask you about that. But before we talk about these murders, I'd like to ask you about the Atlanta Race Riots. I don't believe they've come up on this show before. I've done an episode on the tragic events in Tulsa a few years ago. But would you summarize the Atlanta Race Riots for us? Because they're partly responsible, right, for the charged tensions that exist in the city when the killings began.
Absolutely. Atlanta was a very unique place, especially for the Black community in the late 1800s, post-Reconstruction, moving into the Jim Crow era. A lot of people have called certain parts of Atlanta throughout history the Black Wall Street. And as you know today, and I'm sure most of your listeners will know, Atlanta is pretty well known for a very affluent Black upper class, or a very strong Black middle class. There are lots of wealthy African Americans who call Atlanta home, a lot of international superstars, political figures who've called Atlanta home, including Dr. King and the King and Scott families. Well, that kind of got started after Reconstruction, leading into the era that we would call the age of the Atlanta Race Riot. Now, that happened in 1906, but the roots of it kind of go back several decades before 1906. Before I go any further with that, let me also tell your listeners one of the best books on the Atlanta Race Riot, if not the best book, is by Rebecca Ann Burns, who I believe was a journalist in Atlanta. I can't remember all of her biography, but she wrote a book in the early 2000s called Rage in the Gate City, and it was about the Atlanta race riots. And they called Atlanta the Gate City because of the Gate City rolling mills. Other legends say that it was named the Gate City because it was kind of the gateway to the South, or it was the city that was changing and would be kind of a gateway into a new era. Well, during the time after Reconstruction, leading into the turn of the century, one of the things that you see emerging in Atlanta is a wealthy black. There was a group of black elite who acquired not only a great deal of wealth, but also were able to take advantage of education and status. Well, and as you know, there are a lot of HBCUs in the Atlanta area who got their start during this era. Spelman College, Morehouse College, Clark Atlanta University, which merged Clark College and Atlanta University. You have W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Of course, Du Bois teaches there in Atlanta. Booker T. Washington gave the Great Atlanta Exposition speech at the Cotton Exposition. Atlanta just is the crossroads of African American history. Well, one of the things that also cropped up in Atlanta at that time with a growing black population were the saloons back on Decatur Street and in the Central Business District. Well, as we move on, it makes a lot of African Americans affluent, and it makes the conditions in Atlanta, also the educational opportunities, makes a lot of African Americans very well educated. So they began to grow and thrive. Well, this presents a problem to some of the politicians and the white ruling class over Atlanta at that time. So they become to be very uncomfortable. Well, this culminates in the 1906 governor's race, which involved two Democrats. Okay, back in that age, there was what they called the all-white Democratic primary. And in Georgia, all the way up until, I'd say, the late 1990s, if you weren't a Democrat, you never got elected, especially at the county and state level. Growing up in the South, particularly in Southeast Georgia, we didn't meet too many Republicans. It wasn't until the late 80s and 90s before people began to actually, in that deep part of the South, identify with the Republican Party. Those were people that got elected on the national stage, but very rarely in Atlanta or at the courthouse in Georgia. So Hoke Smith and Clark Howell, whoever won that runoff, or that primary, was going to become the governor of Georgia, and it became Hoke Smith. Well, Hoke Smith was the former publisher of the Atlanta Journal, and Clark Howell was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. Now, you probably recognize the names of those papers because they are one paper today, and we call that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Well, they were trying to basically out-racist one another because even though Clark Howell and Hoke Smith were progressives, remember the progressives have not done very much at that time, by that time, for African Americans and equality, if you will, or the rights of African Americans up to that time. You also have on the Georgia scene the populist Thomas E. Watson, who eventually would become a United States Senator. He was in the United States House of Representatives. He, Clark Howell, and Hoke Smith pretty much whip the state into a frenzy and create this frothy racial atmosphere, particularly in Atlanta, and it all is from the tension that has kind of come about because of black voting rights, because black men were able to vote at that time, not black women or white women, but black and white men were voting. But there was a great deal of effort by the political powers that be to try to disenfranchise black voters, African American men, and, if you will, quote unquote, keep them in their place. Now, with that being said, Clark Howell and Hoke Smith just went at it during that race, publishing articles, editorials, traveling the state, speaking in front of large groups, and a lot of the things they talked about were the disenfranchisement, or what would really be considered disenfranchisement of Black Americans, and basically trying to stoke the fears of the white middle and lower class. Things like, if we don't make changes, they'll get ahead of you. Well, that was all the norm during those days. So here's the backdrop. What happens on September 22nd, 1906, is you have the Atlanta Constitution and Journal, both of those papers, report an incident that involved what they say 4 women, white women, who were attacked, and they blamed Black men. There was scant to little or no evidence that those attacks happened, and there certainly was no evidence that Black men perpetrated that. So between September 22nd, which basically that was a Saturday, so this is a weekend thing, between that time and that Monday morning, a huge mob of white men and boys had gathered downtown in Atlanta. The mayor of Atlanta at that time was James G. Woodward. He did what he could to try to calm the problem, but he did not take care of the problem. And so the mob began to grow, and they got down on Decatur Street, Pryor Street, Central Avenue, which at that time was the central business district in Atlanta. And as the mob grew, they began to attack Black-owned businesses. They smashed windows. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous figures in Atlanta history during this time, and still today, was Alonzo Herndon. He owned barbershops in downtown Atlanta. He owned the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, very wealthy, lived in a mansion with a butler who was from Great Britain, a white butler from Great Britain. He was doing quite well. They tried to destroy his business. They entered streetcars and trolleys, dragging Black men and women off of them and assaulting them. And finally, eventually, the governor had to summon the Georgia militia around midnight, I believe, on that Saturday. On Sunday, the newspapers had reported that the militia had been called out to control the mob. And by the aftermath of this, about 10 African Americans had been killed. As a matter of fact, Dr. Clifford Kuhn and Gregory Mixon from Georgia State University, in their writings, have reported that the coroner in Fulton County had to issue 10 death certificates for Black victims. There were 2 whites who were actually killed as a result of the riots and the mob. One was a white woman who had a heart attack when she saw the mob gathering in front of her home. So about a dozen victims are the ones that this mob and this rioting led to their deaths, or can be attributed to their deaths.
Right. So on April 5th, 1909, a woman named Della Reed was found dead on Rankin Street in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. What were the circumstances surrounding her murder, and is this generally considered to be the first of the Atlanta Ripper murders?
Yes, Della Reed would be probably a very clear first victim. We don't have really too much evidence of this going on before April of 1909, when Della Reed was found in a trash pile, if you will. Interestingly enough, between that point and almost a year and a half, somewhere by the fall of 1910, you could say that a Black woman was being murdered pretty much every month. And that represents a very distinct murdering spree in Atlanta during that time. No one could turn their back on that. Now, let me say this about those murders. The circumstances were somewhat similar in the sense that they were all younger African American women. They all tended to be located, or their homes were located in one particular area of the city around the 4th Ward, the old 4th Ward, which is a very historic and up-and-coming area of Atlanta today. This is also an area where many of these residents lived and their families lived. Della Reed died on April 5th, 1909. There were other women who were found in similar conditions. Some had been beaten to death, some had been shot, some had been bludgeoned to death. A few of them had severe trauma, blunt force trauma to the head. A few of their bodies had been mutilated. As a matter of fact, that some of them had been disrobed partially, and parts of their body, their anatomy, that would have been very inappropriate to expose at that time, very much so, were cut and disfigured. So there was a great deal of cruelty and perversion also involved in this.
So the frequency of the murders and the different ways that the victims were murdered, it makes it hard, correct, to conclusively pin them on a single killer. It's a lot more personal, killing someone with a razor, than it is shooting them from a distance, which suggests that there were two or more people out there doing this. Did the police believe that these murders were all the result of a single Atlanta Ripper? How long did it take for them to start trying to connect them all together, or did they do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It didn't hit them up front. Of course, there was some suspicion as you get into the later part of 1909. When Della Reed was murdered, there were a lot of people who felt like that was just a passing crime, that she was a victim of her circumstance. There were even a few of these women early on. And like you said, when you're stabbed to death with a knife, that's a great deal more personal. You're going to be in the face and very close, not only to the killer, but if you are the killer, you're going to be really up close and personal with your victim. Also, there's a great deal of risk if you are a killer using a knife or blade or a weapon that is not a gun to commit the crime, because, as you know, a gun can be discharged from a good bit away. So when they're stabbed to death or they're bludgeoned to death, that you have to be very close to and be very up on that victim. So that doesn't mean these killers knew their victims, although some in the press and in the Atlanta law enforcement community did argue that the perpetrators could have been husbands or disgruntled boyfriends. And I do believe that a few of these eventually were labeled that. The proof was in the pudding. And as a matter of fact, a couple of these disgruntled husbands were found out. They didn't cover their tracks very well, and they were arrested and put in jail. I can't remember which ones they were, but that did happen. But the Atlanta press actually is going to be credited with moving this more and more closely to a serial killing spree, if you will. They were the ones who eventually referred to the perpetrator or perpetrators, because there's a lot of people out there in the criminal justice field and the historic community who believe that this was the work of one man up front and then some copycat killers. And there are also those of us who believe some of the murders were attributed wrongfully to this phenomenon, that they were ancillary just around the same time. That they believe that some of these killings, of course, happened just randomly. But the press began to call this phenomenon the work of the Fiend, and then eventually the Atlanta Ripper, and that harkens back to the imagery of what you saw in London in the 1880s with Jack the Ripper I believe in the Whitechapel district. One of the things that I've always found interesting in the annals of criminal history are those, I hate to call them ancillary murders, but those that are on the side, if you will, that don't get reported that much, because law enforcement figures out that this is not part of the greater phenomenon. This is not the work of this serial killer. This is not the work of whoever or whatever is perpetrating these deaths and these murders, but yet they happen so closely that they can be utterly disguised for a time. Science and technology and criminal investigative procedures have come so far today that it's hard for someone to disguise their crime under the umbrella of a serial killer. I hate to simplify it like this, but you do have some in history, some perpetrators in history have says, well, let me take care of my problem while this is going on. And that did happen during the Atlanta Ripper phenomenon. Now, we don't have, some of the husbands who were arrested never came right out and said, well, I decided to do this because the police were already looking for a black man out killing young black women on the streets of Atlanta, but it happened.
And we will be right back after some brief messages.
And we have returned. So you've had a chance to examine the police files on many of these murders. Were the police thoroughly investigating each death? Was this a priority for the police department?
I would not say that it was a priority. It eventually became one because of the context that these murders happened in, the fact that they were young African American women. It would take someone who would be oblivious to history, or just someone who wanted to turn a blind eye to what was going on in history, to not understand or not see that because these were young African American women, the Atlanta Police Department, the leadership of the city of Atlanta, and the state of Georgia at that time were not giving them the attention that they deserved. Eventually, over time, however, it did get the attention of the police department. Now, they investigated every murder. And the Atlanta Police Department files that are out there, they still exist, but the press actually did a better job covering a lot of this and providing the public with information. And when I was researching my book over a decade ago, and I talked with an intern at the Atlanta Police Department, she told me, she said, to be honest with you, you're getting more from what you are finding in your databases with the Atlanta press and the other news outlets, historical news outlets of the day, than you probably would glean from these files, because so much was missing. And those files were already over 100 or almost 100 years old. Some of them were at that time. So as you can tell or would surmise, they were in bad shape. But what I gleaned a lot was the fact that every one of these murders did get some attention. So in the white community, even though there was a great deal of distance, if you will, socially, politically, economically in Atlanta, black families and white families, particularly amongst these victims, were connected, because guess who a lot of these young black women worked for? The upper middle class and some of the elite in Atlanta. A lot of these young women were actually, not all, I wouldn't even say an overwhelming majority, but a significant number of them were actually murdered on their way to and from work under the cover of darkness, because they were either going to their place of employment early in the morning or coming home deeper into the evening after supper was served and the family had retired. As a matter of fact, the incident with the Sharps, Lena Emmylou Sharp, were both attacked. The mother was killed. Now, she was actually going to the grocery store, but Emmylou Sharp was attacked going out looking for her mother. But they themselves were out and about on the streets as a result of, well, not just their job, but their daily lives. But some of the women, like Emmylou Sharp, were on the streets because of their jobs. There was not much lighting in these communities where these women lived and eventually were murdered, because the disparities. You've got economic disparities in the city. The city had not actually put transportation in the old Fourth Ward. They had not put transportation in the areas where some of these women were killed. Street lighting was not very readily available in those communities at that time, because those were traditional poor black communities. So you see the disparity there. The killer was able, or killers, were able to take advantage of that. So you do have some connection to the white community when it comes to these murders. So what you can logically assume where I'm going with this, the white Atlanta community became concerned because, one, you've got this, whatever this is and whomever this is, seems to be running unfettered on the streets of Atlanta. And if they're killing young black women, then what's to say that they cannot kill young white women? Okay. The second thing is, it was also taking away some of the people that were working in the homes in the white community. And so this also was a little bit of an alarm to young black women who were reluctant to replace these women or to go out and seek these kinds of jobs. They were afraid. They didn't want to go out on the streets, particularly at night, because this, whatever he was running around, again, unfettered. So it became a problem. Also, it made Atlanta look bad. This is a time in history where Southerners are trying to make sure that our Northern counterparts understand that we are not a bunch of backwards, unbridled, rabid racists down here, because we were hoping to attract Northern investment into the business community and the industrial sector of the South. It had been primarily an agricultural region, and we saw what kind of trouble that got us into after the Civil War. And people like Henry Woodfin Grady, the publisher, an Atlanta newspaper publisher, and people like the Bourbon Democrats were out there saying, we need to diversify. Well, you can't do that with Southern money all the way, because we were devastated during Reconstruction and after the Civil War. So we need that Northern investment. Well, Northerners are not going to come down here if you have a bunch of rabid racists running around contributing to riots on the street. And who knows? There were some people who believed that some of these white politicians or white business leaders had put whatever man this was, or group of men, out there on the streets and encouraged them, if not paid them, to do these murders. Now, we don't have any evidence of that. That's just a theory. And we do know, based on the eyewitness evidence of several of these women who survived, including Emmylou Sharp, that the attacker was a tall, slender black man. There has never been any evidence that this was a white murderer or a white killer. So, but at the same time, the white community, business, religious, political, and social parts of white Atlanta and white Georgia were saying, well, we need to get a hold on this. We need to stop this. And then a ring of jewel thieves started breaking out in the city of Atlanta, and they were breaking into white homes and stealing nice, fine, old family heirlooms and valuable jewelry. That became a problem, because now we had a riot, we now have a series of killings, and now we have basically a jewel theft ring. Atlanta was getting a lot of negative press, and I'm pretty sure your listeners can put two and two together. This is what led the police departments, at the hands of the politicians, pretty much to press further and harder into solving these crimes.
So you were talking about Emmylou Sharp, searching for her mother, Lena Sharp, and this man confronts her. Can you talk more about this confrontation, how it went, what she remembered after meeting him?
Yes. Emmylou Sharp's mother, Lena Sharp, had actually been out shopping. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was grocery shopping, or she'd been to the market. Very different experience than what we in the 21st century would have today when it comes to, going to the market and shopping. But she put herself out on the street at a time when it was unsafe, and she was attacked. Now, she was killed by someone that fit the description of the Atlanta Ripper, what we'd already heard. And she also, the attack itself, very much mirrored some of the things that had already happened to young women in Atlanta at that time. So we're pretty sure that the man who killed her was the Fiend, or the Atlanta Ripper. Unfortunately, what happens is it brings Emmylou Sharp, her daughter, out on the street to look for her mother. She had not come home. It had been quite some time. And from the description that I have read in some of the other sources, Emmylou was a very beautiful young woman. And so she goes looking for her mother, Lena, and she happens upon a tall, slender African-American man. Now, Emmylou Sharp is actually able to identify her attacker. And she is the only one that we know of who was able to recount. There were some who had been confronted by someone matching the description of the Atlanta Ripper or the Fiend, who lived to tell about it. Emmylou Sharp actually had somewhat of a conversation with him. And she walks up, she sees him coming, and she gets a little nervous and scared, and he says something to her to the effect of, don't be afraid, I'd never hurt a pretty girl like you or a pretty woman like you. I can't remember the exact words. And she goes to leave because he had just, whoever this is, has told her, don't be afraid. I'd never hurt you. And so she goes to get out of the situation thinking that, okay, well, this is not going to be as bad as I thought it was. I'm not going to be attacked, but I'm going to get on down the street. I'm not going to stand around here. Well, he turns around and stabs her. It didn't kill her, thank God, but she had to live through that ordeal. She was able to identify a man by the name of Todd Henderson. Here's the problem with that. She heard the Ripper's voice. We'll say that she heard the Ripper's voice, even though there's some question about it. But so we'll call him that for convenience. She heard the voice. She saw the face, and she saw the physique and could make a description. Here's the problem. When she was pressed for it, and when she had to fully identify whether or not Todd Henderson, who basically was in that location, was in that area, when she had to identify him, to the best of her recollection, she said that to the best of my knowledge, this is him. This is the man who attacked me. That would never hold up in court today. It's not a very clear accusation, but a clearer accusation does come when the police tell Todd Henderson to speak to her. Because remember, I just told you that he said, I'm not going to hurt a pretty girl like you. I think he said, don't be afraid. I'm not going to hurt a pretty girl like you or a pretty young girl like you. So he speaks to her. The appearance did not automatically 100% trigger a clear accusation. But when he spoke to her, that's when she immediately said, as a matter of fact, she recoiled and yelled and screamed out. And she pinpointed, that's him, that's his voice, that is the one who attacked me. Now, what did the police have to corroborate that evidence? Well, witnesses, particularly a store clerk, put him in that area near the scene of the murder of Lena Sharp. And also, that's not very far from where Emma Lou Sharp was attacked. The interesting point in all this, too, or an interesting side point, is another murder that had taken place, Sadie Holly. Witnesses also indicated that Todd Henderson had been with Sadie Holly and brought her to the store where the witness saw her the night of her death. This is almost insurmountable evidence. We have an eyewitness account. We have other witness accounts putting him at the scene of the crime, in the location when these crimes happened. And now we have someone saying, well, he was with Sadie Holly when she came into the store on the night she died. Todd Henderson never admitted to killing those two women. As a matter of fact, he's very ardent, very adamant that the reason that he was in those areas was because that he was seen by those witnesses is because that he lived there. And interestingly enough, and it's not even funny, but it is somewhat humorous in light of the fact that we were talking about copycat killers who might have been disgruntled husbands. Todd Henderson kind of makes the remark to an Atlanta investigator and a couple of police officers. He said, look, I'm not a killer. He said, but if I were going to kill someone, it would be my wife. You see what I'm saying? All of full circle. Here's the other interesting piece about Todd Henderson. Several of the murders that took place, other women besides Sadie Holly and Lena Sharp, and the attack on Emma Lou Sharp, happened not far from his home. So that's going to lead Atlanta police to really pinpoint him and make him more so than a person of interest. As a matter of fact, there was even, I believe there was a trolley conductor, if I'm not mistaken, who said that he was able to place Henderson in the area the night of Sadie Holly's murder. But there were other things that were kind of confusing. There was another man who was accused of other murders that are lumped into this by the name of Henry Huff. And so one of the witnesses actually said, well, we also saw Huff with Sadie Holly the night that she died. It goes back and forth, so it's almost like, well, it could be Henry Huff, it could be Todd Henderson. But then we have another piece of evidence that does surface. Todd Henderson said that he did not own a razor, but police, as they investigated, said that he had taken a razor to a barber shop the day after Sadie Holly was murdered to get it sharpened. Now, let me tell you a little bit about why that might be logical. Men, of course, razors today, the way we shave, it has the handle and then the little thin blade inside the plastic or metal casing. In those days, razors kind of looked more like a switchblade, if you will. I mean, it opened up and kind of flipped open, and on one end you have the razor. Well, those periodically had to be sharpened. You didn't just go back out and buy them. They weren't disposable. They had to be taken to be sharpened. A lot of times barber shops would sharpen them for people for a small fee or as a favor because those individuals would come there and do business. My grandmother was a beautician for most of her life, and she would tell me about those kinds of things because I found it very interesting because she would cut both women and men's hair. And she would tell me the story about when she were little growing up, men would often go to the barber shop to be shaved. Well, men who were fortunate enough to have their own razor blade, a lot of times would pay barbers to have them sharpened. So do you see how that's almost damning evidence? And Sadie Holly was cut with a razor. So eventually what happens to Todd Henderson? As naturally you would assume, he's arrested for the murder of Sadie Holly because it's very damning evidence that he more than likely killed Sadie Holly. But he did not get arrested for the murder of Lena Sharp, and he did not get arrested for the other murders that were in the vicinity. They do take him off to jail. However, what becomes of Todd Henderson? He and Henry Huff, neither one are convicted for any of these murders. For a long time, as I was doing my research, I thought that Todd Henderson might, because I'm reading this kind of researching it chronologically, building a narrative here, if you will. I thought as I was doing this research on Emma Lou and Lena Sharp, who, by the way, are the two, well, Emma Lou Sharp is the most fascinating of the stories to me and what she had to live through. I thought that Todd Henderson was probably the Atlanta Ripper. However, this is very helpful to Todd Henderson, but unfortunate in other circumstances. The murders continued even while Todd Henderson and Henry Huff were in custody.
Yeah, so, it must have been traumatizing for Emma Lou Sharp. First, she has this violent encounter with this man. Right. And then she goes home. She discovers her mother has been killed.
She goes home and she finds out. It's reported to her that her mother's body has been found. Then she identifies her mother. That is probably the most traumatizing experience I can think of, save, for example, the actual murders themselves. And those women are not able to live to tell about it. I know that's traumatizing, but to think about the fact that you were almost a victim of the Atlanta Ripper, but your mother was a victim of the Atlanta Ripper. There are two figures in this story that really jump out at me as far as victims and potential victims, and that's Lena Sharp and Emma Lou Sharp. And then on the other side, another individual, and I think I dedicate the book to all of the victims and the Sharp and the two Sharp women, but I also dedicate it to Reverend Henry Hugh Proctor in Atlanta, who worked tirelessly to get a resolution to this and to get government officials and law enforcement to please help them stop this in the Atlanta Black community.
We will return after this quick break. Back again.
It's true, right, that a number of these murders in the first half of 1911 all happened on a Saturday night. Do you think it was a coincidence, or was it a pattern by a serial killer?
The old saying goes that may be too coincidental to be coincidental. So I'm of the mind that more than likely it was not. One of the things that we have to remember about the Atlanta Ripper was if this is indeed the work of a serial killer, one serial killer, you have his MO is to prey upon young African American women who were on the streets of Atlanta traveling to and fro, and he operated under the cover of darkness. That is going to be, Saturday evening is going to be a time when you have more activity like that. Unfortunately, also, some of the victims, especially toward the middle years, were women who had very questionable lifestyles. As a matter of fact, Dr. Henry Hugh Proctor often referred to them as women of the evening. And he chastised some of the women, young women in the black community at that time for being on the streets at such an hour, doing things they shouldn't be doing. And so therefore, they were asking for it, if you will. He didn't put it in quite those words, but that would be sort of a modern day interpretation. And some criminologists and some ethicists would even say that's victim blaming to a certain extent. But I'm not here to judge his words, but interpretation of those words is that more than likely you had activity on the streets in the group upon which the Atlanta Ripper preyed. Now, when you look at some of these women, they were domestic servants. Saturday is a great entertainment day. Saturday evening in the upper class, middle class neighborhoods where these young women were doing domestic service. For example, one of them was a cook. A couple of them were, I guess you could call them almost like governesses. They provided child care and other domestic services. Well, Saturdays are busy times. They are work days. Saturday, most people that worked in those days as domestic servants worked 6 days a week, and some of them worked 7 days. In the African American community, Sunday is a very sacred space, as that tends to be a very religious community, particularly at the turn of the century into this era. And so if you're going to do anything, you better get it done by Saturday, because for those who know a lot about African American customs, especially in the Protestant churches in the South, church on Sunday is an all-day event. So you're not going to be able to do much on Sunday outside of your religious worship. So you do have a great deal of traffic on the streets of Atlanta during those hours because of those things. So I would imagine that would actually be a time frame where he could go in, if you will, after those people upon which he preyed, and there would be a greater number of them. So I'm going to lean more toward that wasn't necessarily a coincidence, but it's certain. I don't know that it was a modus operandi, because I think it was just a matter of convenience. Now, later on in the killing spree, there were some women who were attacked outside of the Saturday night time frame. So that kind of lends itself to appear that maybe he was not married to a Saturday evening, if that makes sense.
Yep, it does. So both Lena Sharp and Sadie Hawley were killed in July of 1911, but between their murders, there was an attack on another woman named Mary Adele. Can you explain what happened?
Yes, absolutely. So Mary Adele, a lot of times I like to liken her or put her in what I would consider to be somewhat the same category as Emmylou Sharp. Now, you mentioned Lena Sharp. Lena Sharp was about 40 years old, and she was one of those victims in the 1911 time frame, close to the time that Mary Adele was attacked, the other one being Sadie Hawley. Lena Sharp was actually attacked on July 1st, 1911. Shortly thereafter, you have another individual, because Lena Sharp, her daughter Emmylou Sharp, comes out to go search for her, as we've talked about, and she comes face to face with probably the man who killed her mother. Emmylou Sharp was a little younger. Her mother was 40, so that puts her probably somewhere in the age of her early 20s. She is able to hear the man speak to her. She's able to see him. Mary Adele is going to fall into that category too, because she was attacked somewhere around July 20th. Not necessarily on July 20th, but somewhere near July 20th. And the reason I say that is because you do have, in the paper, you do have several different dates, and the dates that are given generally are at the top of the article. Now, interestingly enough, the biggest article that ran where you can get the most information about Mary Adele, ironically enough, is from a newspaper up in Vermont. There was some information in the Atlanta Constitution, the Atlanta Journal, and it had a lot of this same information, but one of the better write-ups that I've seen actually was in a paper called the Montpelier Evening Argus in Vermont. Interestingly enough, though, the headline was Jack the Ripper. Now, that'll tell you, too, that, well, several things. One, this phenomenon had become somewhat widespread in its reporting, or its its transmission, if you will. People all over the country were reading about this, and that was much to the chagrin of the leadership of the city of Atlanta and the state of Georgia. Well, this also tells us that what most of these newspapers outside the South were picking up on was the Atlanta press's moniker of the Ripper. And that is because he began to start kind of resembling a Jack the Ripper type character, if you will. Around July 20th, he would have claimed his ninth victim, and her name was Mary Adele, Yedell. I think the L is silent. It's spelled Yeldell. She was about 20 years old, and she was a cook. Now, she came out of the home of one William Seltzer. That's the gentleman for whom she worked, his family. She had gotten only about a half a block away from his home, and she hears what she thought to be a whistle. Now, that's interesting, because what in the world would this guy be using a whistle for? Well, you don't want to go to yell and scream and get kind of loud and give your voice away, so to speak, and you don't really want to use your voice unless you have to, which makes it kind of odd that he would have spoken to Emmylou Sharp like he did. But he intended to kill her, and she got away from him. And notice that when he attacked Emmylou Sharp, he was very close to her. So I would imagine that this killer is trying to use the whistle to get the attention of the young lady without using his voice. If you can get right up on someone and talk to them face to face and then do the attack, you're pretty assured you're going to stop them from identifying your voice, because you're going to kill them. Well, he was kind of a piece away and blew the whistle. That was to get her attention, I'm pretty sure, without giving away his voice. So she turns and looks. I would too, someone blowing, because of course, who most commonly uses a whistle in those days? Police officers. So I'm sure she probably thought that was a police officer. And he may have also had that as one of his reasons for using a whistle, that she would mistake that for a police officer. I think it may be a little of both. He didn't want to yell and scream and get his voice out there. People might say, "Oh, I hear so and so," but I think also the whistle would have maybe confused his would-be victim, making her think that a police officer was flagging her down. So she turns and looks, and she saw what resembled she says in her words, a giant Negro, very black, with a cat-like tread. Or that's what the paper said that she explained to them. But that's the description that she gave to police and that the press picked up on in July of 1911. So when she sees this giant Negro man, as the press called him, coming toward her, you know in her mind she has heard about and is aware of all this stuff going on in the community and with the attacks just 9 days earlier on Emmylou Sharp and the murder of Lena Sharp, as well as these other women going all the way back to 1909, and the press talking about the fiend or a Ripper-like character. She gets scared and she runs. Now, the thing about it is she runs back to the Seltzer home. Just in time. As a matter of fact, apparently this guy got close enough to her with, some members of the press called it like a saber, but it was, others just said a long knife. I would imagine it was just a long knife, because it would be pretty obvious walking around. You'd give yourself away walking around with a long saber. I mean, you're not going to be able to hide that very well. It's much easier to hide a longer knife than it would be a saber. So apparently he got close enough because he cut her clothes in several places. I've read anywhere from 4 to 6 slashes in her clothing. Don't know if he cut her any deeper than that, but she was actually able to get back to the Seltzer home, ran up to the porch. Mr. Seltzer comes out on the porch, meets her. I suppose she's able to tell him what's going on. So he runs out to the alley, which is nearby the home where they are, and he finds the man, who seems to be just nonchalant. I would imagine just standing there or just looking around. Maybe he was trying to give off the appearance of, hey, I just walked into this alley because I heard a whistle and some screaming. And I'm looking for the same thing you are. What happened? Apparently, Mr. Seltzer didn't fall for that nonchalant attitude he had. and he had his revolver, just like a lot of men did back in those days and still do today. And I imagine he probably had that for protection as well, because he knew what was going on and that this was someone preying upon domestic servants who were young African American women. And Mary Adele is certainly that. So he points the revolver at the man in the alley and tells him to hold up his hands. And that didn't work. There may have been an escape route very close by. I'm sure he probably knew the ins and outs of the alley. When he got in there, he saw a way to get out of there. But at any rate, Mr. Seltzer lost him. He didn't put up his hand. He turned and ran off. And some interviewers have asked me, do you think that William Seltzer advertently allowed him to escape? No, I don't believe that at all. I believe there was so much chaos. I believe that there was so much going on. He was probably scared. If it were me, I would have been sweating, no pun intended, sweating bullets. He's worried about his cook, Mary Adele. I'm sure he's concerned about his family inside the house, and mistakes were made. So this then goes pretty much in the same category as Emmylou Sharp. She came face to face with him. She saw him. She was able to describe him. Now, what we don't have a lot of is where anyone in the press wrote that she was able to identify him by voice. I don't even know that she was brought in front of a suspect. I didn't see any of that. But she got a look at him just like Emmylou Sharp did.
What are the chances that the men identified by Emmylou Sharp and Mary Adele were both, in fact, Todd Henderson?
Well, a lot of people have speculated just how much or how involved Todd Henderson was in all of this. If there is a guy out there that people say they feel like is responsible for part of the Atlanta Ripper murders, it is Todd Henderson. The other guy that they hauled in, and they had several suspects. There was another fellow, of course, that we've mentioned, and that's Henry Huff. There is a reasonable description that matches all three situations. Okay, so what I mean by that is you have Emmylou Sharp and Mary Adele, who have both seen this person. They've described him as being a tall, slender African-American man. So we know at least the attackers on Mary Adele and Emmylou Sharp met or matched that description. You also have people, and we know what Todd Henderson looked like. He was a tall, slender African-American man. You also have a description of Henry Huff, who very similar to that description. A little bit of a variation, but very similar. Interestingly enough, Jim Conley, several years later, who gets mixed up in the Mary Phagan murder, he matches that description too. The other thing is, you look back at Mary Adele's description, and she calls him a giant. Well, I would imagine if I'm a scared young woman in the midst of the Atlanta Ripper phenomenon, I've been reading for those, and there were some of them who could read. If I've been reading some of these things, or I've been listening, especially if you attend church, they were talking about it in the churches. Dr. Henry Hugh Proctor, the pastor of the Wheat Street Baptist Church at that time, was preaching, stay off the streets, get out of the streets, stay off these dangerous corridors. This fiend is out there running around loose, and it doesn't seem like anybody's trying to catch him. So these young women were already scared. So you turn under the cover of darkness and you see a man running toward you. And I imagine he had his knife out at that point. She's going to be scared, and he could have been 5'8", and she would have described him as a giant. I know I would. So, yes, you do have some people who thought that could be Todd Henderson. Now, the thing about Todd Henderson is you had the whole thing about the razor blade. Some people could make the case that this could have been Todd Henderson with a razor blade, or that, he could have easily, had something in his hand that resembled a long knife, but rather was a razor blade. I'd rather think, probably based on what I'm reading here, that this was not Todd Henderson, because keep in mind, with all of these murders going on and things like that, you already have a lot of chatter. And so I would imagine that would not be Todd Henderson, but you cannot rule it out. But again, the description is close.
Yeah. Which of the Atlanta Ripper murderers most closely resembled a Jack the Ripper murder? in your opinion?
So the murders themselves, of course, we know did look a lot like what happened in London in the 1880s with the Jack the Ripper phenomenon. And that's mainly because a lot of the victims' throats were slashed. There were other injuries to a lot of these victims. For example, some of them had their heads bashed in. Some of them were actually cut in different places. You do have some victims that were beaten. Rosa Trice was a 35-year-old woman who her throat was slashed. Her head was beaten. She was beaten in the head with by blunt force with an object. I would say that probably would fit close to some of the Atlanta Ripper murders. I'm sorry, the Jack the Ripper murders, simply because you have a slashing of the throat and an attempt to do something ungodly to the body. Now, one thing we have to remember about Jack the Ripper in London is that his MO was not just to cut up the body, but also to do some disembowelment. As a matter of fact, I believe Mary Kelly, the last victim he went into an apartment of hers, or a room where she lived, and it almost looked like he was trying to embalm her or do an autopsy. I mean, it was awful. You don't really have that with the Atlanta Ripper. There are some things that are taken from the crime scene, shoes. There are some body parts that are cut. As a matter of fact, one victim, a breast was cut. With Lizzie Watkins, she had been cut, her throat had been cut, and her body had been dragged several paces. I mean, she was dragged a good little piece by the Ripper. Addie Watts also was dragged. He would deposit bodies in clumps of bushes. So there's a bit of a difference. But I would say probably Rosa Trice. I would say if you really had to pin me down on one, it would be her, because he slashed her throat and beat her in the head. So, and I say that because it looked a little bit like what Jack the Ripper was trying to do to the bodies, where he was trying to do ungodly, morbid things, awful things. So if you had to pin me down to one, it would be that one.
There was talk about putting a black detective on the case, right?
Yes, that's right.
How did that work?
Well, that didn't work. That never happened. As a matter of fact, it would be mid-century before the Atlanta police. And I just read the other day the name of the officer, and I can't remember it because I periodically will go back and read snippets of my own book and have questions and go, oh, I could have probably added a little bit here and there. So the first thing that jumped out at me about 3 months ago as I was looking over the book, someone called me and asked me if I'd just talk with them about the book, another historian. The first thing I thought when I read part of this was I should have really put something in there about the first African-American officer in Atlanta that didn't come for quite some time. It was talked about. So let me just say this. The very nature of that, the very thing that they would talk about in terms of, well, we do need to try to put someone on the force who is African American who might be able to help us find the solution to this, or at least be a good conduit between Atlanta PD and the leadership of Atlanta and the black community. That is a step in the right direction, but I'm afraid that it did not work out. It never came to fruition. It would be sometime later before that happened. And they were beat cops. The police officers who were hired were street cops. And they sometimes called them beat cops. They were not detectives, because, as you know, it takes some time before you're promoted to detective.
So how many victims were there total attributed to the Atlanta Ripper or Rippers? And when did the killings come to an end?
It's hard to say when they came to an end, because around March of 1914, you start to see a lull. Now, one of the things that happens in 1913 is the death of Mary Phagan, and I know you probably are familiar with that case.
Yeah, we have covered that case on the show. I did a 2-part interview about Mary Phagan and Leo Frank.
Interestingly enough, Leo Frank was imprisoned here in the state prison in Milledgeville, and if there weren't trees and buildings in my way, from my office window, I could see where that old state prison was.
Wow.
And the lynch mob that came and got him came and grabbed him and took him back to the Atlanta area and lynched him, but he was housed right down the street from where Georgia Military College is practically. And so that, what does Mary Phagan and Leo Frank, what does that have to do with the Atlanta Ripper? Well, two things. It diverts attention away from these murders now because you have a young white girl. I think she was maybe preteens. I can't remember exactly how old she was. But you have a northern Jewish man who is accused. And you also have Jim Conley, a tall, slender African-American who police suspect could have partnered with Leo Frank in the murder of Mary Phagan or been there or knew more than he was telling. Well, let's go back to his description. He was a tall, thin African-American man. Now, Conley eventually, it was pretty much found out without much doubt that Conley was not the Atlanta Ripper. But for some time, it was believed that they had caught the Atlanta Ripper and stopped him because they had caught Jim Conley, or they had focused attention for the murder of Mary Phagan or the involvement of Jim Conley. I believe that a detective by the last name of Burns, I can't remember, I'm digging deep in my memory of the book now, with the Pinkerton Agency, pretty much proved that, Conley was not involved in any of that, did a lot of research and I think investigation. And it had to do with evidence of where Jim Conley was nowhere near those places when some of these murders happened. But that gets in the way. That diverts a lot of attention in between 1913 and 1914 when you get everything that goes on with Leo Frank and the murder of Mary Phagan. So it diverts a lot of attention. By the end of this, if you were to take it at its full throttle, there would be somewhere between 25 and 40 women who died in this time period. And there are actually murders that take place as late as the late 19-teens into the early 1920s that some have called a result. These murders are a result. They say, they pinpoint them as a result of the Atlanta Ripper killings. Some of them are as far away as Gainesville. I'm not really sure I believe that those were a product or a result of the Atlanta Ripper, but they have Ripper-like characteristics and Ripper-like qualities to them. There's some similarities. But I'm not exactly sure I'm prepared to say that's, that they were a result of the Atlanta Ripper.
Have there been any new suspects since your book was published? Anything new to report on these cases?
Mostly what has happened is as this becomes more and more notable and people begin to find out more and more about the details of this phenomenon, people speculate. There were a couple of people who have surfaced as possibilities, but they were people that had already been written about. A lot of what really gets talked about is what we just said, Todd Henderson and Henry Huff. Most people that I talk to that have written or researched this, either a little before or after my book came out, believe that Todd Henderson was at least guilty of the murder of Sadie Holly and probably guilty of the murder of Lena Sharp. There was also a man by the name of Charles Owens. He was actually convicted for one of the Ripper murders and served life in prison or sentenced to it. The funny thing is that the papers and the files that all of us have gone through to try to figure out what murder was he accused of and convicted of doesn't mention it. However, just like with Todd Henderson and Henry Huff, when Charles Owens went to jail, guess what happened? The killing continued. In 1912 became probably some of the worst years in the Atlanta Ripper killings. By 1914, you actually have something that happens that really puzzles authorities, and it puzzles crime historians. It gets their attention. In 1914, you have the appearance of notes pinned to fireboxes. And I wrote about it in the book. Journalists have written about it because this is quite interesting. the notes are pinned on fireboxes in the city close to where these murders have happened. One of the letters actually threatened to cut the throats of all Negro women in Atlanta who were out and about late at night. And it's interesting because the notes were signed Jack the Ripper. Now, if you remember back during the Jack the Ripper phenomenon, those killings, there were notes that were sent. And the movie that portrays this a little bit, although it's somewhat of a fictionalized account, is Johnny Depp in the movie From Hell. It focuses a good bit on the writing of Jack the Ripper. Who knows? That could have also been the work of a copycat, or that could have been the work of someone trying to be silly or get their 15 minutes of fame, so to speak, as could have been the case here in March of 1914. Another thing that becomes discussed, or has been discussed as of the last few years, is the wording, cut the throats of all Negro women. Okay. That could have implications, or there could be some interpretation there that a white man wrote that. Cut the throats of all Negro women. Whoever wrote that made it a special point to make sure it was, not saying I'm going to continue to kill women on the streets of Atlanta, or I'm still out there. I'm still preying on the women of Atlanta. I'm going to keep killing, whatever. It says, cut the throats of all Negro women. Some have speculated that that could have been written by a white person who, A, was trying to keep the black community in discord and discombobulated and fearful to go out on the streets. There could have been some political agendas behind such a note. The fact that it was signed Jack the Ripper, and that very name invokes fear. So hopefully that makes sense too, some of those theories, and hopefully that can continue to be investigated. But that we're so displaced by time from these murders, it's going to be hard for us to ever pinpoint who and what and why. So you also understand too that the criminal mind, and I love reading about this. I love it when criminologists write about these kind of things, and psychologists. Criminal masterminds and serial killers and people who commit these kind of heinous acts, they like to read about the stuff in the paper. That's their only claim to fame. That's why they have calling cards. They usually take some piece of evidence or something from the crime scene. They collect something to remind them of the murder or the crime. There's a certain amount of notoriety. So it could have been that this was a hoax, or it could have been that the killer was trying to focus back on his acts and focus the public's attention on what was going on, especially if there were copycats kind of stealing his thunder. I don't know. I mean, some of that could be a stretch. Some of it could be dead on. But I think all of these things are in the realm of discussion, at least noteworthy of potential discussion and debate. And Eric, that's what makes it's not a fun thing. It's what makes it interesting. It really, crime and trying to solve crimes and criminal justice, criminology, looking at this kind of stuff is a great way here in academia that we build critical thinking and deductive, analytical, inductive, all of those reasoning skills, inference. Law enforcement, those who are trained in law enforcement will tell you this is hard. A lot of times, to be a detective, to be a criminal, to be an investigator, a homicide investigator, any law enforcement official, you have to think quickly on your feet, and you have to be very capable of critical and metacognitive thinking. You have to rethink everything. You have to think outside the box. You have to look for what doesn't make sense, or what's out of place, or what is out of sequence. You have to be able to sit and think about things in a very creative way, because sometimes the most unlikely scenario is the scenario. That's what happened. And then again, sometimes I've had some friends of mine who are detectives who know that I wrote the book, and that's why I'm friends with them, who tell me that sometimes the answer stares you right in the face, but it's too simple. So that can't be it. No, that can't be what happened. That's too easy. When in reality, that's what the killer or the criminal was banking on, that would be too easy. I think back to what was the movie with Sharon Stone, and I believe it was Michael Douglas back in the day.
Basic Instinct.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of, and we still don't know, I don't know if there's ever been, I know movie buffs have debated who truly was the killer in that movie. But one of the things, remember, in the movie was, no, she couldn't have done this, because why would she write a book about the crime that she's about to commit? And that would just be too obvious. And I think someone in the movie says, well, wait a minute, wouldn't she want you to think that very thing to sort of push suspicion away from her? Because why would a murderer, write a plot into her next fictional account based on how she committed the crime? That would pinpoint her. Well, that's too obvious. So I've actually had some of my law enforcement friends that I just mentioned who bring that movie back up. I believe that's what happened. Someone in the movie said there's just absolutely no way she could be the killer, because she just wrote about it. Why would she write a story about the crime she's about to commit? It's too obvious. Well, that sometimes is what killers and murderers want you to think. I'm not sure that was the case with the Atlanta Ripper. I don't know at all, but sometimes the simplest solution is the solution, and the simplest scenario is the scenario, when in other instances it's very convoluted. It's very weird. It's very far-fetched. Again, and then when you have 100 years separating you from these crimes, more than 100 years. For example, in 1909, when Della Reed was murdered, we're looking at 114 years ago, last month. We're probably so far removed from those and the Jack the Ripper murders that it's going to be hard for us to figure out what truly happened. That's why we do these things, right? That's why we have these podcasts, right? And write these books.
So for people who want to check you out, you do have a blog, as I mentioned earlier,
yes.
And your specialty is Georgia history.
Yes, that's right. And my specialties and focuses when I studied academically were Georgia history, particularly between the Revolutionary War and the Mexican-American War, the rough and tumble age of the 1830s and 40s. But then I began to develop a love of mystery and how it cross-sections, where history and mystery intersect. And so I just began to write a lot about folklore and legend, and then true crime. And this book was a product of that. There are about 3 or 4 books that I have out. I've written about a serial killer, a train crash, a legend or cryptid monster, and then I wrote some vignettes about the history of the city of McDonough for a fundraiser for breast cancer awareness. So my mother said, there's a little bit of a theme there, Jeff. Maybe you need to write about something a little bit more cheery rather than monsters and serial killers and train crashes. However, we can learn a lot of lessons about who we are as people by, our folklore and legend. We can learn a lot about who we are and what we expect out of humanity when we study criminal history and our reactions to it. So hopefully this will get more attention. I hope that more and more people begin to look at this and remember the names of Sadie Holly and Lena Sharp and Emmylou Sharp and Henry Hugh Proctor and these people who deserved their time in the sun for what they had to endure and what they tried to do to stop it.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate this time with you and your listeners.
Again, I have been speaking to Dr. Jeffery Wells. He is the author of The Atlanta Ripper, the unsolved case of the Gate City's most infamous murders. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.